this is, of course, the Ice Bowl game, and it also, in terms of this story, takes place in any coming-of-age story. There comes that point where the character does come of age sexually, and Mark has recently come of age sexually, and under the advice and guidance and wisdom of his father, who's sage in these matters, his father told him, that this is a good thing, that this activity would be very much like playing with his best friend. And so Mark has taken this advice to heart and plays with his best friend as often as possible. So he has just recently come into this portion of his life, and it is now the last day of the year, 1967. It's been a little over 39 years since this game actually was played. This is a section from chapter 8, where the O'Byrne family is coming to grips with Mark's alleged talents, be they real, be they imagined, be they psychic, be they simply a heightened sense of intuition. This is an abridgment from chapter 8. This is called Faith. On December 31, 1967, the last day of the year and the day of the rematch, Mark awoke with a fever. It was not a slow-moving virus either. His temperature was 103 degrees, and his head was completely plugged with mucus. It was one of the worst colds of his entire life, and would eventually evolve into a secondary infection requiring antibiotics. Anna told him to stay in bed, though he no longer wanted to be in bed. It was game day with everything on the line, yet there he was. Chester encouraged him to rest until kickoff, and then get up and give it a go. He reminded his son, all the great ones played with pain. Mark promised his father he'd be ready. Paul justifiably avoided his youngest brother like the plague. It was New Year's Eve. There were parties that night. He did poke his head into Mark's room and offered that debilitating illness might make an excellent tough shit card in Monopoly. Mark smiled. Anna ruled the situation. There would be no misplay on her part this time. She was on the sickness like a leech. Cold medicine, fever medicines, and one full glass of water downed in her presence every hour on the hour, with strong encouragement to finish the refill before she returned with the mandatory drink. Within 2 hours of getting up that fateful morning, Mark was peeing like a puppy dog. So much, in fact, he volunteered to use the staple of hospital life and long driving trips, the male urinal, so he wouldn't have to get up so much. His head eventually felt neither completely sick nor well, it just felt drugged. This was not an entirely unpleasant feeling, and certainly better than how he'd felt upon waking. His cold, however, was not his only affliction that championship Sunday. At the first commercial break from the pregame show, Chester and Anna looked at each other. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Conditions for the championship game at Lambeau Field in Green Bay were the coldest they or anyone else had ever witnessed. As a former player and coach, Chester knew you could not possibly prepare for these circumstances. And to top it off, their secret weapon was in bed. It was Mark's worst cold ever, and the worst cold ever for a championship game. It was kind of ironic. Chester and Anna looked at each other and began to laugh. They bent over and they laughed, and they stood up and they laughed. They bent over while standing and laughed. They were hee-hawing like donkeys. Then in a moment only they would ever know, one of those once-in-a-lifetime bursts of insane inspiration, they clasped together like lock and key and did the Tennessee two-step to music only they could hear. There was no melody, yet they knew the song that was playing. Though they hadn't danced together since 1951, their steps were in perfect time while they smiled and shook their heads yes. Anna proudly beamed as she swung. He works in mysterious ways. Chester replied as he swayed, Yep, we got quite a boy. The dance and laughter abruptly ended. Chester Morgan O'Byrne, you listen to me, Anna began firmly though softly. This is important. Our youngest son has a gift. It's more than a gift, though. It's a miracle. We both see what's happening here today. When he sees what God Almighty has wrought for him, he will know from whence his power came. With equal conviction and surprising compassion, Chester responded, "Anna, I've listened to you. Now you listen to me. You say this thing the boy can do comes from God, and I just don't know if that's true. I let you raise these boys as Catholics because you believe in God. You know how I was raised. I believe in bacon and biscuits and what a person can do with their own hands. Maybe I'll believe like you do someday. Then again, maybe I won't. And I'm still not certain Mark can do what we think we've seen him do. I do know one thing that's true, though. That child came from an act of love between us. After 4 miscarriages, after he's here at all, is the greatest miracle to me." Each of them pondered what the other had said, but they both remained firm in their convictions. It was Chester who finally set the family back to task. "Sweetheart, I know there's one thing we agree on. We got Lombardi right where we want him." Anna agreed with this because time was ticking down to kickoff, she redirected herself to task. She would not fail in her duty this year. She announced to her husband, "Chester, come help me with the boy." Mark heard them coming down the hallway. With barely enough time to finish his piss/drip into the male urinal and pull up his pajama pants. In the rush to not have his private scene, a little of the 3/4 full bottle splashed over the side and onto the sheets. Anna was the first to enter, and she saw the accident. Her knee-jerk response, though sweetly stated, was, "Once a clumsy oaf, always a clumsy oaf." Chester grabbed Anna by the shoulder, firmly turning her around. He admonished, "Don't ever call him that again." "Shit, shit, shit," she thought. "I did it again." She turned and broke from Chester's grasp, advancing toward the bed, saying, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know you're not a clumsy oaf." She hesitated and briefly considered if she believed those words. Then she continued, "I don't know what I was thinking. Let's pretend it never happened, okay?" Whatever, Mark thought. There were more important things on his mind. It was almost game time and he was in ragged condition. There was a loud, high-pitched hum in his left ear, and his right ear felt barricaded by sandbags. "What's happening?" he asked weakly. Anna was relieved and Chester was proud. Their boy was far beyond insult or careless words. He knew it was almost game time, and he was in mode, if dramatically weakened. Anna helped Mark to his feet and passed him to Chester, who aided his youngest son to the living room while Mom tended the sheets. Upon entering the living room, the first thing Mark saw and heard was living, breathing stadium. Like no arena, time, ritual, or circumstance ever recorded, the roar of the crowd was not of this time, and hearkened to something more primitive, something from legend and lore. By the time Mark was seated, he was shivering. All he could think to ask was, "What's wrong with the TV?" "There's nothing wrong with the TV," Paul responded indignantly as he left his bedroom and entered the living room for the first time since turning on the set and making whatever adjustments he could. Then, with grudging respect, Paul acknowledged to his brother, "I suppose this is all your work." Mark could not as yet grasp this. Then he heard the temperature in the stadium was 13 degrees below zero. It was the coldest day on record in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The entire field was either partially or entirely frozen. The television showed a close-up of the crowd. This would reveal much more to Mark, except he couldn't see their faces. They were all covered. You could see eyes on most of them, but only the foolish showed their noses, and only those who were drinking exposed their mouths. There were many people drinking. Some were fortified even before they entered the stadium, determined to stay tanked for the duration of the day. Conditions were identical for both teams, but the net effect could not be called the same. Packer coach Vince Lombardi was smiling and exhorting his troops like a man who could not have been happier. It almost seemed like the conditions were his wish, his doing, and his destiny. Or perhaps his bravado was merely the joy and contentment of knowing more than ever how close he stood to his God when he said his prayers. Vince Lombardi was a proud Catholic. Cowboy coach Tom Landry was no less devout than his counterpart, albeit Christian. Landry would one day be reverently labeled as God's coach, though technically this isn't true since he never coached Joe Montana. But when the cameras swung their merciless gaze onto the Cowboy team, Landry's jaw was clenched tighter than his butt cheeks. He knew every strategic advantage for his team was nullified by the conditions, especially the frozen field. Perhaps worse was the psychological effect of Cowboy players standing and watching Packer players warm up before the game as if they were somehow used to this kind of weather. Packer players were suffering just as much. They had to be, but it didn't look that way. Later, Dallas defensive back Cornell Green said, "I'm a firm believer that if one guy had quit, everyone would have quit. I mean, if one guy on either team had walked off and said, 'I'm just not doing this,' I guarantee you everyone would have walked off." But the NFL did not postpone games. They even played the Sunday after JFK was killed and the entire nation was in mourning. They were not going to postpone a game on account of cold. This was one of the things separating football from baseball, a sport that didn't even allow men to play in the rain. Mark had been in cold and snow in Texas, but conditions in Lambeau Field were over 40 degrees colder than he'd ever experienced. Chester played in an NFL championship game in conditions similar to these in 1945, when his team, the Cleveland Rams, defeated the Washington Redskins 15-14 before slightly over 32,000 hardy souls in Cleveland Stadium. But at least a portion of the field was marginally playable the majority of the game. Anna entered the living room and Chester said, "Well, Mark, what do you think?" "It's perfect." Mark said to his father, "Dad, this changes everything. We won't be able to use our speed, multiple formations, or anything deceptive. We won't be able to throw and nobody can run. The Cowboys don't know how to play in this, and neither do I." They all looked at the picture. There he was, Lombardi, smiling like a cat about to eat the canary, moving easily through his team as they warmed up, shouting encouragement, seemingly reveling in what he wrought, gliding over the frozen tundras if also made of ice. Anna said, "Oh, dear Lord, that Dago Lombardi's a Catholic, and Landry isn't." She hesitated and then looked at Chester before adding with deep disappointment, "Oh, heavens, and neither are you. Goodness, Chester, Mark's right. He doesn't know anything about this. This is all Lombardi's doing." But Chester O'Byrne was not yet ready to concede, not when there was still a game to play, and he was getting sick and tired of the whole Catholic religious thing. This was a football game. It would be won or lost by the men who played the game, not by a choice in God. Gritting his teeth, and with somewhat less sensitivity than earlier, Chester said, "Maybe you're right, Anna, but there's still 60 minutes to find out. One thing I know I'm right about is this. You do know how to play in this, Mark, because I've played in this. Anna, don't you remember Cleveland? I know you do. You say your butt still hadn't thawed from that day. But Mark, if I know how to play in this, son, listen to me. It's in your blood. Even if you didn't help make this happen, you still know what to do. I'm telling you, it's in your blood. We can win this thing." Despite the hopeful, though somewhat angry words from Dad, the only thing in Mark's blood, mind, or body of which he was certain were at least one virus, several chemicals, and an ever-developing realization that he needed to make some new friends. The game began, and the referee who blew his whistle to start the contest had the unfortunate experience of having the whistle freeze to his lips. "I hope those fools have some Vaseline," Anna advised. By early in the second quarter, Green Bay struck for 2 long pass plays and led 14-0. Meredith could barely throw, much less hit an open Cowboy receiver. They seemingly could not pass or run. Just as Mark suspected, all the pregame strategy was a waste of time. Their superior team speed was rendered useless. As for Mark, he didn't know where or how to start combating the various conditions. As it was during the Ram game earlier in the season, no pattern or repetition was allowed to emerge. Touching himself only made him ache in spots and itch in others. All seemed lost. But just like the last championship game, when every effort appeared futile, it was Chester who summoned the experience only age could teach. He said, "If we don't catch a turnover soon, we're dead." These seemingly hopeless words about a flying pastry brought glimmers of possibility to Mark. They needed a break. It was not going to come from the offense. Green Bay had the ball deep inside Packer territory. Bart Starr faded back to pass, got hit by Dallas defensive end Willie Towns, and fumbled. The other defensive end, George Andre, picked up the ball and ran the few remaining yards for a touchdown.
"That's a baby! I told you, didn't I?"
Chester shouted toward his family, and they all nodded because, in fact, he did tell them. Then, 2 minutes later, just before the end of the first half, Green Bay fumbled a punt, and Dallas recovered close to the Packer end zone. They still could do nothing with their offense and settled for a 20-yard field goal by Danny Villanueva. At halftime, the score read, Packers 14, Cowboys 10.
"Well, we're right back in it,"
Chester proclaimed with a little smugness to Anna, certain the tide had turned. She picked up a piece of the Sunday LA Times and started reading, turning her body and head toward the light streaming through the sliding glass door separating the living room from the front balcony. Paul was also reading a portion of the newspaper and kept his face covered. Mark stared at his father, whose attention was still directed toward Anna, though Chester declined, for the moment, to say more. Mark wondered if his father knew he'd just predicted a portion of the game in much the same fashion as they had all come to expect from him. He wondered if his dad was just lucky. He wondered why Chester seemed more angry than satisfied. It was all rather upsetting to Mark, and despite the sudden positive turn of events in the game, he desperately needed to carve out some alone time. He got up and said, "I'm going to use the bathroom now." "I'll help you back there," Anna offered, dropping the paper and rising to her feet. "Mom, I'd like to go by myself," Mark gently requested to Anna. Chester immediately chided,
"Doggone, woman! I think it's time you let the boy piss in peace."
Reluctantly, Anna said, "Well then, at least let me help you off with your clothes. You'll feel better with fresh clothes."
"Are you nuts?" Chester scolded. "Change his clothes? What's the matter with you? If we win today, he might not change his clothes until after the Super Bowl. When you're on a roll, you don't do anything different."
Anna was shocked at overlooking this all-important fact of sporting life. But like the clumsy oaf remarked to Mark earlier in the day, she knew she could still minimize potential damage. "Sorry again, baby," she stated, though Mark sensed her apology was not entirely genuine. He could tell something else was on her mind, and it was also colored by anger, though Mark possessed neither the energy nor the inclination to inquire. "It's okay, Mom," he finally offered. "I've done this on my own before, you know." Yes, she supposed he had, and let it go. But she kept one ear trained for any sounds coming from Mark's bathroom or the hallway. No matter what else was going on, she would not fail again in her duty to her baby. As soon as Mark got to the bathroom, he yelled, "Hey, Ma, could you fix me a little snack? Maybe a Polish with some kraut?"
"Damn good idea,"
he heard Chester agree. Mark listened as Anna shuffled around the kitchen and began preparing her particular brand of short-order wizardry. More than needing food, Mark desired privacy. More than the tension in the living room or his complete ineffectiveness during the championship game, he harbored a problem requiring immediate attention. He didn't know if what he was going to do would help, but he was certain it wouldn't hurt. Even though his ears were clogged, he could still hear the stirring of spoon against pot, the slapping of sausage against pan, and the sliding of pan into position under the broiler. This was more than enough noise to disguise his actions. He opened the door of the bathroom, closed it without sound, and tiptoed 7 steps to Mom and Dad's bathroom. He turned on the light, found what he needed, and quickly applied the remedy. Anna took a look from the kitchen door down the hallway and noticed his bathroom light was on. Her bathroom light was on. She didn't remember leaving it on, but maybe her atheist husband had. Mark's bathroom door was closed, and all was quiet in the apartment except for a Norelco ad on television. with Santa sliding down the hill on a circular rotating electric razor blade. She wanted to go and turn out her bathroom light, but she loved the advertisement, so she stood and watched, thinking it strange they were still showing the commercial when Christmas was already almost a week in the past. She was briefly reminded, however, of the spirit of the season, and the smell of Polish began to fill the house. She turned back into the kitchen, determined to complete her chore before the second half kickoff. Mark finished his business and left his parents' bathroom, turning off the light on the way out. He opened his own bathroom door and turned out the light. He returned to the living room, and the smell of steaming sauerkraut and broiling Polish sausage was soon filling his nose. The smell was reviving, and he was certain he'd taken care of his problem. He was anxious for the game to resume, because he felt so much better and on the verge of an understanding. Dad just might be right. It was in his blood. The field was growing more frozen by the minute, and shadows were imminent. The game was close, and people were drinking heavily. By many accounts, Lambeau Field smelled like a saloon. Even those with no interest in alcohol were raising their masks for quick snorts from any nearby flagon. It seemed the thing to do. Hell, it was the only thing to do. The marching band set to perform flatly refused to perform under the conditions. The stadium bathrooms were nightmares because pipes were beginning to burst. Anna brought Mark water and a fresh assortment of pills to swallow. He didn't ask what he was taking, he just popped everything into his mouth and swallowed. "I'll bring you your food in about a minute," she added hurriedly, because the second half was about to begin. She would see to her task, but she resented having to miss a single play, and it would have been nice if someone at least offered to help her. It was in the third quarter that the truth began dawning on Mark O'Byrne. There he was, with the worst cold of his young life, and there they were, playing the championship game in the worst cold of their lives. Coincidence? Maybe. Yet, to Mark, there suddenly seemed a link. Without being able to pinpoint how, and without any practical experience to guide him, Mark seemed to know what needed to happen. It was true the weather was bad for both teams, just as it was certainly true the weather was worse for the players from Dallas than it was for the players from Green Bay. That truth allowed the Packers to capitalize on the poor playing conditions for 2 early scores. They knew if players were forced to run a long way, a very good chance existed they'd slip and fall. Dallas adjusted to this strategy by going to a zone defense and allowing no Green Bay player to get past them on the field. This forced the Packers to maneuver themselves over an open a larger portion of frozen ground, an almost impossible task under the circumstances. Conversely, the Dallas offense was virtually paralyzed, and Don Meredith was incapable of throwing in the extreme cold. Any other condition, including rain and wind, and Don Meredith was primed to play the game of his life and redeem himself, cast aside all doubt, and claim the greatness he felt was rightfully his. But Don Meredith was still hexed, and Mark knew it. Somehow a strategy needed to be devised that didn't include the starting quarterback. Mark considered injury, but that was too obvious and rather unsporting. No, it would have to be something simply excluding Meredith from a critical hand in the execution. What to do? Anna placed a full plate of broiled Polish sausage, steamed sauerkraut, kosher pickles, and marinated pears on Mark's lap. Under well circumstances, he'd have attacked the meal like a guard dog. Instead, he stared at the smorgasbord of delights and listened to his father chew. Mark dared not look, yet he couldn't help himself. It was pure mastication. Despite the fact that these actions seemed rather appropriate, given the primal man conditions on the television screen, watching his father eat eliminated any desire for food. Chester noticed this and yelled in the direction of the kitchen.
"Honey, the boy's not eating. Better fix him something else."
"I don't want to miss any of the game," Anna protested from the sink as she washed her hands before rejoining the family.
"I know that," Chester acknowledged, "so you better hurry up. It's starting."
"It's okay, Mom," Mark gently advised. "You should come in and watch the game."
"Fix him some food,"
Chester ordered while Paul made a slight hue adjustment to the picture. "Don't mess things up," Chester warned Paul, though Anna thought he was still talking to her.
please would have been nice, Anna thought, but still determined to do whatever it took for the day to succeed. She bowed her head, asked for no help, was offered none by her family, and so commenced preparing salt pork, biscuits, and gravy.